Are you a church leader trying to navigate the tension of doing ministry both online and in person? Welcome to the Bricks and Clicks Church Leadership Podcast, a podcast where church leaders and ministry experts share ideas, solutions, and experiences about making church work both in person and online. Meet the hosts of Bricks and Clicks, a Brit and an Aussie who became friends in their efforts of making churches irresistible. Duncan Banks lives just outside London, England, and Jason Perkins lives in Brisbane, Australia. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Banksy and Perko.
Well, g'day everyone, and welcome to our webinar, wherever you're at in the world, watching from maybe the UK and Ireland, or if you are in the great southern land of Australia, or maybe our friends over the pond in New Zealand. We are so pumped that you've joined us here tonight. My good friend Dave Adamson, 45 minutes north now of me, no longer a 15-hour flight north of me, or even worse, 25, 30, I don't know how long it would have taken, but 45 minutes north on the sunny coast of Queensland. So good to have you, mate. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. And my co-host, Duncan Banks in London, England, and it is bright and early in the morning. Guys, we are super excited tonight about the conversation that we're having. In fact, we've got over 100 people that are joining us from around the world to learn, hey, how do we navigate this complex world that we're living in now, where we're doing church online and in person in some parts of the world like we are down under. So Duncan, how are things in the UK? Because you are not able to do church in person like we are. How are you guys doing up there? And while he's answering that question, guys, we would love it if you're watching if you would just jump into the chats and let us know the church you're working at or that you're affiliated with and where you are in the world, where are you watching from. We would love for you to let us know that in the chat. So Duncan, how are things up in the UK right now? And where are things at when it comes to church in person online?
We're very jealous of you guys, not just because of the sunshine in Australia, but we're very jealous of you guys because, we've been in lockdown since Christmas, and it's most likely that we're not going to be able to meet in person until the summer, probably maybe even further into the autumn. So it's been tough. It's been tough being locked down, and all these people jumping onto the chat, they'll tell you time and time again, it's just been difficult. You can't see your granny and your grandpa. I haven't seen my dad for nearly a year. He's 87 years old and I haven't seen him for nearly a year. It's tough times. So we're really interested to pick Dave's brains today. So, enough chat really. Let me introduce Dave. Perko, do you know who said this? Dave is the most experienced faith-based social media expert in Australia and one of the most sought after online church strategists in the world. Who do you think
said that?
Yeah.
Who said that? Did the same person also say that he has a ninja skill ability of writing bios, like his own bio maybe?
No,
like
he never said
ninja
that.
skill levels.
No, you know who said that? It's the lady who wakes up next to him in the morning said that. Is that right,
Dave? Okay. The lady.
Well played, Duncan. Well played.
Yes.
So that's Meg, and of course, when your wife writes something nice like that, you put it on Instagram and Twitter for everybody to see.
Everywhere.
Hey, listen, Dave, last time I spoke to you, last time we were on a webinar together, you were the digital pastor, and you had been the digital pastor for a decade at Andy Stanley's church in Atlanta. And like Perko says, you're now 45 minutes up the road from him. What happened?
Yeah, well, essentially the bottom line of what happened was my eldest daughter was on the world race. She was doing a 9-month stint overseas in 3 different countries serving as a missionary. And when COVID and lockdown hit, she got forced back to the US, where we had been living for 13 years. And, she told us that she wanted to go to college. She wanted to do university in Australia. And so we were like, hey, this seems like a good idea to potentially move back with her. And then as part of that, at around the same time, Orange, which is a church strategy company based in Atlanta, had asked me if I wanted to join the staff team there. I'd been working with them for a while, and they said, we want to have somebody in Australia and who could oversee Orange in Australia and New Zealand. Would you be interested in doing that? And so the timing just fit perfectly. And so in the middle of a global pandemic, my wife and I packed up our house and all of our possessions and our 3 kids, and we moved back to Australia. Which might seem like the weirdest thing in the world to do. But when we land here in Queensland, and Perko knows this all too well, where I live right now, there hasn't been a case of COVID in probably about 9 months. I have not worn a mask since I got off the plane.
No,
and
don't.
Restaurants are full.
No.
The malls are full, the shopping centers are full, and church here, of all the church leaders I've spoken to, are roughly about 85% back to full capacity. So it's pretty interesting. It's a pretty interesting time to be living right here where I am right now. Yeah, I'm getting this global, I feel like I'm getting this global perspective of what's going on in the church as well, beyond just the American church, which, I've been connected with for so long.
So let me nail something straight away. After what you've just said, some people get the impression that people like you, these sought after social media strategists around the world, people like you and Carey Nieuwhof and others, they get the impression that you're anti in-person church, that you're the kind of person that says, we should do away with church as we've known it before. Let's forget about meeting together. We don't need a building anymore. Let's just do church online. Is that what you're trying to say? I mean, is everything going to be virtual now?
Yeah, if I had $1 for every time somebody has hit me with Hebrews, do not give up meeting together, I'd be a rich man for sure. Because that's what I get hit with most. And my constant response is, I've never once said we shouldn't give up meeting together. All I'm saying is, I lean into Mark that says, go into all the world and preach the good news. Well, all the world in the modern day era includes social media, it includes online platforms, it includes podcasts, it includes YouTube. All of these places are all the world. And so I think the church needs to be going into those places. And I also lean into the fact that, I've got three daughters who are in their late teens, or, my eldest is just turned 20, and they live online. Their community is found online. Their context for living life is online. It's online where they make major discoveries and major decisions about their life. And I want to make sure that those decisions are backed and have a foundation in faith. And so I'm encouraging church leaders to continue to be online, because selfishly, I want my daughters to have faith-based leadership online in their world. So that's a big part of what drives me around those things. And plus also the other thing is that, studies have shown that pre-COVID, before lockdown even happened, the people who attended church had stopped attending church. Church had increasingly, one of the things I always say is church attendance wasn't decreasing, it was decentralizing. Even before COVID hit, in the 2018, we started to see this big shift happening where people were accessing our content online and taking fewer steps inside the church building. It just took a global pandemic to legitimize church online. It took a global pandemic to legitimize putting messages up on YouTube. And so now this is going to be I honestly believe this is the future moving forward, that as the capital C church, we need to find ways to build community around our content. That's going to be the big thing going forward. How do we as church leaders build community around the content that we're broadcasting out? And that community has to happen locally, wherever you're called to serve, whether that's in Ireland, whether that's in England, with London, if that's in the Sunshine Coast, whether that's in New Zealand. You have to try to build community around the content that you're serving out into the wider community.
Already, I've got a million questions. And if you're listening to this and you're in the chat and you're thinking, oh, Dave's talked about the content driving community, but how does he ask some of these questions? And we might even get you on the panel and get you to talk about that. Dave, one of the things I've noticed through COVID, I'm just wondering how you think COVID has changed our engagement with church. Because certainly I was talking to my son, who's married and lives a couple of hours away from me now. But he was saying, I've started doing click and collect at the grocery store, the supermarket, where you just go online, someone else picks all your shopping and you just go pick it up at the front door. And he says, why would anybody go in a store anymore when you can do that? And it only costs you like £1 for them to do that. It's crazy. So it's changed the way he relates to the local grocery store, local supermarket. Lots has changed in the way we relate to things. How do you think COVID and this pandemic has changed the way people engage with church?
Yeah, so such a good question, man, because the reality is all of this was happening in the world pre-COVID. It's just a lot of Christians have finally become woke to the fact that this was already happening in the real world, right? I look at my own family. Since 2015, we've slowly increased the number of gifts that we buy at Christmas off Amazon. In fact, about 3 years ago, 95% of the gifts that we gave our daughters for Christmas were delivered by Amazon. And they didn't think the experience of Christmas was any less just because we got all of our stuff online. We've been able to get Uber Eats for several years now in the real world. Starbucks has always had an app where, I can order a coffee while I'm, still warming up my car in my garage, and then I can pick it up on the way through and it's already paid for. Like, this stuff has already been happening. It's just the church hadn't caught up to it. But now with COVID, the reality is that for a lot of people who attend your church or who used to attend your church, their habits have shifted so much that they've become used to accessing your content online in the Sunday mornings in their pajamas, or even Sunday evening or Monday evening when they're watching it on video on demand. Like, that's just the way that it started to happen. And we as church leaders, we can either fight against that and push back on that and say, no, you have to come to a church building, to a specific place at a specific time that we deem required, or we can go with it and we say, hey, we're going to put on this event, this physical event in a building in person, but we're also going to stream it online to fit in with that video on demand lifestyle that everybody has. Just before we came on, the three of us were talking about watching Ted Lasso, and I'd said that I watched it 3 times, the whole series. I didn't watch that when the TV company decided I should watch it. I watched it on demand because that's the world that we live in. So that's why I say it's really important that we start to build community around the content that we're putting out, and always remembering that Jesus came not to establish a church building, but to establish church community. So, in Acts, it says that the disciples, they listened to the teaching of the apostles. It doesn't say that they necessarily all met together at the same time at the same place, but they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. This is what's happening in the world right now. People are listening to you. If you're a lead pastor or a preaching pastor, they're listening to your messages online, maybe podcasts, maybe on a website or a church online platform, maybe even YouTube, Facebook, Instagram Live. How do you then build community around that? That's the next step for us as we move into an era that's post-COVID.
Yeah, I'm going to get Perko to get, there's some brilliant questions in the chat. What you're saying, I mean, we could finish it here because people could take stuff away already. Some great questions in the chat. I'm going to get Perko to bring a few people on. But what you're saying essentially here, Dave, is, am I right in thinking this? As lead pastors, should we be thinking of church more like Netflix? Is that kind of...
You've really put that in a way that's going to drive this Hebrews crowd towards the gathering together. Look, I was on a podcast early last week, and one of the things I said was, I think the era of the mega church is over. And the host of that podcast stopped me and said, well, we need to go back. You need to explain that. And I was like, oh gosh, should I have said that? But that's honestly what I think. I honestly think the era of a mega church is over, because people can now listen to your church. Like all the church leaders who are watching right now, if you're a lead pastor or something along those lines, people can listen to your message on podcast. I think the big idea, the thing that we most want, is that they're gathering together in circles during the week to discuss that content in a community. It doesn't have to happen on Sunday between the hours of 9 and 10 a.m. It can happen in people's homes if they're accessing that content online or they're listening to it on a podcast. And the reality is, this is not a COVID thing. I think we all keep saying, oh, it's COVID, change the church. No, this was changing. All the studies across the world show that people had stopped attending church on a regular basis. The regular church attendee was attending once every 5 weeks. That means of the other 4 weeks, they're watching on YouTube, they're watching on Facebook, they're listening to a podcast, they're on your website, they're watching video on demand. They were already doing that. It's not changed, but we just need to change our approach to it now that that model, that habit has really settled in on the people in our church.
Yeah, brilliant.
Duncan, we've got a couple of questions for people that are coming in, and I'd like to bring somebody in to ask their question live on the panel here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in Maddie Banks from the UK, Finch Hampstead Baptist Church, is with us. Maddie, great to see you, mate. Thanks so much for joining us. Yeah, what time is it in your neck of the woods?
It is 9:15 currently.
9:15 in the morning. Just so you know, Wednesday's a great day. Dave and I have experienced it. Phenomenal day so far. So you're in for a great day.
Good, no surprises.
Maddie, Maddie, you had a great question. In fact, you had a couple of great questions, and I'd love it if you'd ask Dave those questions for us live.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great. So I was wondering, I'm currently reading Nona Jones's book, the social ministry stuff. And she talks a lot about it in terms of sort of discipleship, just viewing it as discipleship, but online. And a huge part of that is fostering the sense of vulnerability and honesty online, which is, we kind of know how to do that in groups, but that's something you do, Dave, on your personal channel really well. Some of the stuff that people open up to you about in the comments, kind of, we would love that sort of thing. That feels like real discipleship. It's not just people sharing what they had for breakfast kind of thing. Have you got any practical tips or advice on how we foster that kind of vulnerability and honesty online?
Yeah. First of all, dude, thank you. It's so good to see you. Thanks for asking that question. Look, the first thing is, unfortunately, this is the bad news. It's a long game. I get that sort of traction on my own personal channels because I've fostered that over a long period of time. And it has required me being extremely vulnerable in the first instance. And, scripture already tells us that people become like their teachers, right? So if we want our people to be authentic and vulnerable online, then we have to express vulnerability and authenticity online as well. And people are ready to do that. One of the things I've found as a pastor is using online digital technology to connect with people and engage with people has made me a more efficient and a more effective pastor on so many different levels, because people inherently are much more open to jumping deep into the water when they're online. I don't know what it is about a face-to-face interaction where people are umming and ahhing and hedging their bets a little bit, but when it comes to online, even though everybody's got a profile pic and their name is prominently displayed, people feel like there's a level of anonymity there. But we just need to lean into that. And you might be thinking, I know there's people who are probably thinking, well, I don't have the time to do that, or because I'm so time poor anyway. But I think it can be extremely simple. I always go back to this one story that I got from a pastor who was in Texas just at the start of the lockdown in the US. And he said to me one day, he'd been posting his messages, 35, 40-minute messages that he took all week to prepare. He'd been posting them on his YouTube channel for about 18 months to 2 years and was getting maybe 280, 300 at the most views on those videos. Then one day, about 2 weeks into lockdown, he took his dog out for a walk midweek, jumped on his phone without any equipment other than what was already in his pocket, and just started streaming live to YouTube and said, hey, if you're in the area, if you're in the local community and you need prayer right now, I just want to pray for you. Just leave me a message, leave a comment, and I just want to pray for you right now live. And what happened was all these people started to take him up on this opportunity because he was being vulnerable, putting himself out there saying, I will pray for you right now. In the end, that video had more than 18,000 views. And he contacted me and said, I don't know why I would ever do a 40-minute message again when I can get 18,000 views just from walking my dog around the block and asking people if they need prayer. That's when we become relevant as the capital C church. Too often we in the capital C church think that relevance is, skinny jeans and tight, big V-neck t-shirts and moving lights and popular music. That's what we think relevance is. But relevancy is really meeting somebody's need at the moment that they need it the most. If I'm stranded in the desert and Duncan comes and gives me a glass of water, he's the most relevant person in the world to me in that moment. So if we want to foster that sort of engagement online where people are being authentic, we need to be aware of what the needs are in our local community. Not what's happening in the Sunshine Coast if you're in London, but what's happening in your community right now, and how can you address that need right now to the people in your who live within a 5-kilometer or a 5-mile radius of your church. That's when the church becomes relevant. And that's when you'll breed that engagement, that authenticity, and set up that discipleship model that you're talking about.
That's so
great.
Good. Can
Maddie,
I ask the second one? Is that
only because you're friends with one of the hosts, we'll let you ask a second question.
Thanks. It's not what you know, is it?
That's too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
it
does lead really well onto the second part, which is that all good discipleship journeys take a disciplee and someone who's doing the discipling, someone who's a bit further down the road. And I was wondering if you had any advice for how you get those sort of people, the people who are a bit further along on their spiritual journey, to invest in the people who are kind of starting out or a bit further behind online.
Yeah, that's the hard part, I guess, right? Is finding those people who are a little bit more further down the journey. But I think they exist in everybody's church. I think sometimes it just requires us to give them a little bit of a prompting, no matter how big your church is. I think there are those people who are ready to make disciples, who are ready to disciple some people, that they maybe just need a little bit of a poke. And for some people, I think it might be overcoming the hurdle of leveraging online technology to do discipleship. I think too often in the church, we've built up discipleship to be this thing that has to happen in person. It has to happen face to face. In fact, I think we've turned it in a lot of churches into like a 6-week course you can do to learn how to be a disciple or to be discipled. It's a 6-week course. That's not biblical. Jesus didn't do a 6-week course on discipleship. He was in people's lives, in his disciples' lives for 3 years, 24/7 across 3 full years. Like, that's what is required. And again, sometimes the pushback I get is similar to the Hebrew stuff. Well, Jesus was with them face to face and personally, yet outside of Jesus, probably the greatest discipler in the Christian Bible is Paul. And Paul discipled people who were hundreds of miles away from him using the technology of his day, which was letter writing. Now, Matt, I know you're pretty young. So letter writing is when you take a pen and you push it down into paper and you move your wrist around. Like, that's the technology of Paul's day. He leveraged that to disciple people who are far away from him physically, right? And I think as the church, we just need to do the same. Find those people who are ready to disciple people in the same way that Paul did, and let them loose on the technology of our day to make a difference in people's lives. It literally goes back to a first century model. We have the technology available to us today. And I honestly think, Matt, you probably know this better than any of us on the panel because you're a digital native. You grew up with this technology. But we have the technology to literally go into all the world. For the first time in human history, we can go into all the world in an instant. Yet we don't leverage that because we place the value of the face-to-face at the expense of the online. And I think that's where we need to shift. And if we can get some people on board at our church who are a little bit further advanced in their faith, who are ready to embrace some simple technology like a Facebook Live or lead a Facebook group, then we can really disciple a lot more people and make it more efficient and more effective than it's ever been before. Because we don't require them to give up one night a week to put 4 hours into a class. They can literally do it in small bursts throughout the entire week.
That's so good.
This is so useful. Listen, while Perko gets rid of Matt and assigns him, and Perko's going to bring a couple of other people on board as well. Dave, just a quick fire question for you. Why do you think lead pastors in particular are afraid of the whole digital thing? I've had so many conversations with lead pastors at the moment who are saying, I'm exhausted just trying to do church online. Yeah. We've been doing that since March. It's a year now, and it's tiring me out. On the horizon, we're going to be meeting in person again. And I listened to Dave Adamson, and Dave Adamson says you have to do omni church, you have to do hybrid phygital church, you have to do church in person and church online. I'm exhausted just doing YouTube church, and now I've got to put a program together in the building. I mean, what is it that's making us a little bit afraid as lead pastors, and how do we overcome that kind of a fear?
Yeah, I want to give 2 answers to this. It's a 2-part answer. The first part I think is a little bit easier, and I think the second part will be a lot harder to I think just a lot harder to hear and maybe a lot harder to digest. I think the first fear is we think that it requires a lot of effort and a lot of resources and a lot of technology and a lot of equipment. I think that's the first thing that sets up an obstacle for us, that we have to have a really good camera with a really good microphone and really good lighting. And our church just doesn't have, A, we don't have the resources to purchase that stuff, and B, we don't have the people to run that. But the reality is, like I said in that story that I told Matt, you can do it while you're walking your dog around the block. Like, it can really be that simple. We have everything we need right here in our pockets, and we have it with us every single day. All we need to do is just lean into it and leverage it. The best lighting in the world, any photographer will tell you this, the best lighting in the world is already provided by God. It's called the sun. If we just sit near a window, that's the best lighting we can possibly have. If you want to improve anything on your smartphone device in order to make it a little bit better, I would say invest, $80, invest 50 pounds in a simple mic that plugs into your phone. Everything else you've already got. It doesn't require a whole lot. I think we put, too often what we do is we put the production ahead of the message. And I think we need to stop doing that. So I would say that's the first thing. We think it requires a lot of time and a lot of volunteers and a lot of equipment. The second thing, I think, that is the fear that I think is a little bit harder to hear. And this is it's because it was hard for me to hear. I think the next hurdle is that we fear not having people in the room who can give us instant feedback to whether or not we're doing a good job. That's what I think it is. I think as lead pastors, as worship leaders, even as well, just to extend a little bit, we measure success on how many people are raising their hands during worship, how many people are saying amen to a point that we've written, to a really well-crafted bottom line that we've worded and we've created and we've put up on a screen. If people say amen, then we think we're successful. But I think the reality is we need to get over that, because the message has never been about us. It's always been about the people who are listening, and we need to go to where they're listening from. And the reality also is that every single day, every single person at your church right now is carrying a pulpit, a worship team, and an offering plate in their pocket. They carry it every single day. We need to make sure we're in here on a regular basis so that we're connecting with them. If we can step over those two fears, the first fear of resources, the second fear of our own ego, then I think it makes it a lot easier for us to embrace the online technology approach.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. That's really practical. Jason, who else have we got asking questions?
So Dave and Duncan, we've got Rachel Jewson that I'm going to bring in to the panel. She's got the question that I feel as though is like the $1 million question. I'm hearing from pastors what I consider the time poor, skill poor, maybe even money poor challenge, where churches are talking about how do we, compete's not the word, Rachel. I think you asked the question really well when you talked about, budget limitations, personnel limitations. Ask Dave exactly what you were talking about when you said the word compete. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we've touched on some of it already, because I was saying, in a smaller church where you haven't got budget, and even more so, you haven't got necessarily volunteers with the skills to operate some. I am thinking more, I guess, of the Sunday experience. But the maybe churches down the road have got all that stuff. It's all out there online. And you suddenly find that quite a lot of your congregation, particularly the younger ones, well, we can choose where we watch. We can start the morning in Hillsong and we can end in Bethel and watch all the churches in between, and we know it isn't a competition. We know that's not the thing, but equally, what's going to stop, if you like, the bigger churches literally sucking the life out of the small ones, I guess.
Wow.
That's a great question.
Wow, Rachel, you are asking, yes, and you're asking the right question. That is such a good question, because especially, and I've heard this a lot over the past year over the last 12 months for sure, that a lot of pastors felt like there was this comparison trap. How can I compete with the church either down the road in another city or even in another country that has been doing online for 5 or 10 years and they've already got all the resources in place? How am I supposed to compete with that? And my answer 12 months ago is the same as my answer today. There is one thing, Rachel, that you can do that Hillsong, that Bethel, that North Point, that Life Church, that Elevation Church cannot compete with in any way, shape, or form. Only you can serve the needs of your local community. They might get their message at Hillsong, they might get their message at North Point, but only you are the person who can have somebody drive around and do a drive-by in their house, in their driveway, and talk to their kids, socially distanced. Only you can provide that sort of thing. Only you can speak uniquely into the problems in your neighborhoods. And so I think as church leaders, we need to be leaning into the calling that we originally got when we stepped into ministry, because nobody willingly steps into ministry. We do it because we got called into ministry, and we got called into ministry usually to serve the people in the local community around us. And we need to go back to leaning into that. It's not about what's happening at North Point. It's not about what's happening in Sydney. It's about what's happening in your neighborhood. And nobody can compete with you on that. Yes, they might have better cameras, better lighting, better volunteers, but they don't have their finger on the pulse of what's happening in your specific neighborhood better than you do. And so that's where I would be leaning. I would make sure that it's all about your local community. My friend Jeff Henderson always says, for too long, the church has been known for what it's against. It's time that they were known for what we are for. And if you can let your local community know that you are for them, then that's going to make a huge difference. If you let the local businesses in your neighborhood, within a 5-mile radius of your church, know that you're for their local businesses, that you're for their local restaurants, that you're for the local emergency services, that you're for the local medical staff and doctors and nurses, then that's going to play, ultimately, that's going to have a bigger impact than anything that Brian Houston will do, anything that Andy Stanley would do, or Stephen Furtick, or any other mega church pastor. Only you can do that.
That's Dave. A brilliant answer, Dave, because I can just, I can imagine Andy Stanley standing on a platform in Atlanta saying, I understand if you're a parent, it must be really hard work homeschooling your kids right now. But Andy Stanley can't go and stand outside your local school and say, don't you wish your kids were back in here? And suddenly it feels
Amen.
local, and I think if we were to work harder to be local rather than try and compete with Atlanta or Sydney, Hillsongs and all that kind of stuff, then I think we're going to win the game, because those guys can't do that.
Yeah.
Dave, I think you hit the nail on the head. I love what you said about the being for the community. Rachel, just to encourage you, a church in our local community just this year started to become much more for their community in an outward way, using their social media platforms, promoting specific businesses and schools and so on in the local community. For the first time ever, and their church is 5 years old, it's a church plant. For the first time ever, one of their local Facebook groups for the entire city reposted their posting about the school in their community. First time ever. So their platform went from maybe 250 people that followed their online social media to thousands of people, because this community Facebook group picked up their post.
So
but
good.
It's really being for their community, like you said, Dave, and extending your reach because of that. So I love that. We've got some other questions, Duncan.
Can I just say, Rachel, one more thing? Leon in the chat just said it way better than I did. He said, don't be the best church in the community, be the best church for the community. So good, Leon. Gosh, Leon, I'm going to steal that and I'm going to tweet it. So we'll put your handle down so I can give you credit. Great question, Rachel.
Hey,
great question.
Yeah, Rachel, thanks for joining us.
Hey, as Perko gets rid of Rach and finds someone else to ask a question.
I won't get rid of you, Rachel. I promise. We're just going back to the attendees. You can stay in the webinar. But you know what, Dave? Us Australians, we don't know how to speak English correctly. So maybe Duncan had it right the way he said it. You guys invented the language, Duncan. You invented this whole thing.
It's a Zoom term. Get rid of. It's a Zoom term.
Yeah. I love it.
One of the things that keeps coming back in the chat, Dave, while Perko finds someone else that we can abuse, one of the things that keeps coming back is something you said right at the very top of the hour. You talked about creating content that drives connection, that drives community, and everybody's going, yes, I want my content to create a sense of community with people, more than just someone in a chat saying, hi, I'm here. How on earth do you do that? How do you create something during the week on a Sunday that drives a sense of people connecting with each other and feeling like they belong and feeling like they matter?
Yeah, man. So again, this is another question that I hear often, because, pastors have the hardest job in the world. We are always time poor. Before the global pandemic, we were time poor. You look at the rate of pastor burnout, like burnout in the church, it's astronomical, because we're so time poor. And so when you hear somebody like me come on and say, yeah, just connect with people during the week, we automatically go to, and I totally get it. Well, how do I find time to do that? There's no time. My schedule's booked. How do I find time to create this new content? And I would say it's not about creating new content. It's about repurposing on purpose. You're a content creating machine. That's what churches are. Churches inherently create content, right? Sunday's always coming. And so there's always probably a handful of people in your church who are always creating content ahead of Sunday. And then once that Sunday is over, we push that content aside and we move to the next Sunday, right? We start regenerating more content. Repurpose the content that you've already created. Repurpose it on purpose. And what I mean by that is take that 35-minute message that you preached on Sunday, maybe live streamed onto Facebook, maybe live streamed onto YouTube. And then on Monday, trim that down to a 2-minute take one point, just one of your points, and put that into a 2-minute video that you push out onto Instagram on Monday or Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, take 2 of your points and maybe churn out a 4 or 5 minute, maybe 5 to 7 minute cut down version of that message that you put out onto YouTube. And then when you put that to YouTube, have links. Use YouTube descriptions, use YouTube end screens, use YouTube cards to push people to the full length message. So a 2-minute message becomes a 7-minute message, becomes a 35-minute message. It's just all happening in reverse, because we're always preparing that 35 minutes worth of content, right? So just repurpose that on purpose and leverage it during the week on the platforms that are appropriate for that sort of content. When I say that, what I think happens in those moments when we do that effectively and we do that consistently, we actually lower the bottom rung on the digital invitation ladder. Say that again. We lower the bottom rung on the digital invitation ladder. Because here's the reality, Duncan. If I go over to my neighbor next door and we're out talking by the letterbox and he says, hey, my marriage is not going well at the moment. And I say to him, oh, really? I'm so sorry to hear that. Hey, my pastor actually did a 35-minute message on YouTube. Let's watch that right now while we're by the letterbox. Well, that's too far a leap. People just don't do that. But if I can send him a 2-minute link to my pastor's message on marriage and how to have a better marriage, then he's more chance he's going to watch a 2-minute message, which leads to him watching potentially a 5-minute version of the same message, which ultimately we hope would lead to him watching a 35-minute message, and then maybe the whole series on YouTube or something along those lines. We have to create these little steps and allow people to take little steps towards this longer form content. So it's not about creating new content. It's just about repurposing the content you've already created on purpose. And then, there's a famous guy who does social media and he's known for social media. His name's Gary Vaynerchuk. He says, don't create, document. Just document your life. It's already happening. Just document it. If you're doing a daily devotional that you read every single day, take a photo of it, post it onto Instagram and say, hey, this is the book I'm reading at the moment. I'm doing a devotion. If you want to read it with me, just jump in. If you got any questions about it, just jump in. Hey, I'm reading Romans 12 at the moment. Why don't you, if you got questions about it, hit me up. Like, do it that way. Just document what you're already doing anyway. And it takes some of the pressure off of creating this brand new content.
That's really helpful, Dave. So what I'm hearing in my head are lots of, the 100 or so pastors that are on our webinar at the moment. I can hear them saying, that's exactly what I want to do, because I know that will create connection. I know that will create a sense of community. That's exactly what but I'm preaching 35 times a year. I mean, week in and week out, I'm having to prepare a message. I'm having to put the Sunday thing together. I'm probably, because it's just a small church, having to set the table and the chairs and everything else up, or, put the YouTube thing up online. what do I do when I'm skills poor and I'm time poor? So that's where I want to get to, but I'm not sure I've got the capacity, because I'm preaching every Sunday, or the skills as a 55, 60-year-old pastor to make those kind of things happen.
Yeah, I think this is where we need to start doing one of two things. First of all, we need to be establishing a bench of speakers, communicators in our church who we're coaching and training up. If the tip of the spear is just you, if you're that point in the funnel that everything rises and falls on your ability to get up every single Sunday and produce something, then there's something wrong. We need to make sure that we're bringing up the next generation, or even peers in your same generation, or even older people who, depending on your age, who are capable of delivering a message and you feel confident in, that they're not going to say something that is going to bring the whole church falling apart. But creating that bench of speakers, I think, is important. And the second thing to that is maybe we need to change up the way that we do things. Maybe we need to change up the way that we produce that message. Because let's be honest, writing a message from scratch takes a lot of hours of work. That's just the nature of the beast. But if we're creating content for 35 minutes, maybe we need to start creating content for 15 minutes. Or maybe we need to bring somebody else in. Instead of just having a bench of speakers, we actually bring a team of speakers on to preach a particular message. Maybe it's all about a conversation at the moment. This is a YouTube thing, right? The channels on YouTube that grow exponentially ultimately do so by getting to a phase where they do what is called a collab. A collab is a collaboration. They partner with another YouTube channel who's maybe got the same focus on the content that they create, or the same niche, and they collaborate with them to create shared content that they both show together. Right? Maybe we need to collab on Sundays. We need to bring somebody else in. So maybe it's, if Perko's preaching, he might bring Duncan in to have part of the conversation with him, and they double barrel preach by both of them taking a little bit. Or maybe it's just the conversation between, hey, we're talking about grace today in our church because we're heading into Easter. And so we've got two people who understand the Hebraic background of the word grace, and they're just going to have a conversation in front of you guys. And hopefully it's going to unpack some things that you've never thought about when it comes to the idea of grace before. Now, that might have some sort of, obviously needs some cohesion around it, but having that halves the work. So anything we can do to take some of that pressure off those pastors, I think is super helpful.
Yeah, that's
Dave,
awesome.
Sorry,
Jason's going to bring someone else on into the call. But there's a brilliant question here from one of the lead pastors in the Further Faster network that I helped to lead. So help us as preachers. I'm a preacher. I know all of us, all three of us are preaching regularly. When we're preparing our 25-minute message on a Sunday, what can we do to make it easier to split up into these smaller social media nuggets that you're talking about? Because just to give the 25-minute message to somebody and say, find a 60-minute clip out or 60-second clip out of that, it's kind of hard. I mean, I've noticed Andy does that, Andy Stanley. I've noticed there's always a little minute clip that he does, and you think, has he purposely done that, or have they found that? Or it just seems, I mean, he's a genius, but it just seems genius anyway. How can we go about creating, I mean, I guess the question is, do we just have to put it into our 25-minute message, or do we have to separately do a piece to camera that's 60 seconds long or 3 minutes long or something?
Great question, Matt. It could be either. That's the reality. I think it could be either of those things. So 2 weeks ago, I preached at a church here on the Sunshine Coast, a church called Sun Coast Church. And the stuff that I was preaching about was specifically around being able to withstand hard times, right? Being able to get through and persevere through hard times. That's what I spoke about. So as I was preparing that message, first of all, I wasn't preparing for a 35-minute message. I was preparing for a 22-minute message. That's the idea that I had in my head. So I instantly shortened that just a little bit. Also, the other thing I did was I created slides that had certain sound bites on them that I knew were quote unquote tweetable. Like they were within, you know, a 240 character word limit that I knew people could tweet straight away. So it was a memorable thing. And that's a strategic thing to make the message sticky, right? So when I'm creating messages, I'm thinking through what is that 2-minute clip and how can I lean heavily into that 2-minute section where I'm making my main point, and how can I make that as sticky as possible? So I will typically work through stuff like that and process some stuff like that. Then the other thing I did is literally as soon as the message was over, I'd been worded up to do this, before the message, but in the evening, as soon as the message was over, I turned around and there was a camera on stage where I did like a 2-minute little thing. Hey, I just finished preaching here at Suncoast. The thing that I talked about was this, and this. The verse I used was this verse from Jeremiah. And so, you know, if you're struggling with anything today, if you want to have more perseverance, if you want to know how to get through hard times better, click on the link below and it'll take you to the full message. Like I did a little soundbite thing that I recorded as soon as the message was over while the content was still fresh in my head. Now, I didn't have to write anything special for that. The content, I just preached it. It was already fresh. So I just turned around and literally just did it. So I think you can do a little bit of both. Now, Andy, he's on a whole other level. He just creates things that are sections of 2-minute tweetable things, right? So that's a whole other level. I'm not at that level, but I do process
on
it.
his shoulders. We're all standing on his shoulders. Let's be honest.
Exactly.
But he's been super kind to put into books and videos so much that we can learn from. It's so
he outlines, yes, exactly. He outlines this. He outlines exactly how he preaches in a book called Deep and Wide. If you haven't read it already, if you're in Australia, hit up Perko, he'll get your copy. If you're in England, or the UK, hit up Duncan, he'll get your copy or help you get a copy. So this is all outlined, but this is specifically how it works. And to me, this is just about, you know, when Matt was on, I look at somebody Matt's age, right? They grew up watching YouTube. This is the sort of style of communication that they're used to, this YouTube style of communication. And I think we as pastors who are a little bit more seasoned, we need to watch that. We need to lean into that. And maybe we need to rethink some of the approaches that we've typically had to the way that we preach. Maybe we need to rethink the model. Maybe COVID is a good time for us to do that so that when we get out of COVID, we've got a style of communicating that will reach more people and last a little bit longer.
Hey, Dave, that's fantastic tips, mate. Fantastic tips. And I would encourage anyone that's listening, watching, you know, now or after the fact, because we will turn this in to a podcast. We then we've stolen all of Dave's ideas. So we'll turn it into a podcast. We'll turn it into our YouTube channel at bricksandclickspodcast.com. You can find all the information there. We'll create some PDF from Dave's insights that, 5 key things that we can send out to you in an email as well to make your online church better. So thank you, Dave, for allowing us to steal all those creative ideas and how we can take a 1-hour webinar and turn it into so much more. Really, honestly, thank you for sharing that with us months ago. So that's the first thing. Second thing, just to take care of a couple of housekeeping things. I want to just quickly give Duncan here in a second a chance before people may have to start to drop off in maybe 15 minutes or so. We'll keep going as long as there are people asking questions. But Duncan, you've got a great webinar coming up for the people in the UK and Ireland with Andy Stanley next week. Is that right? Do you want to just quickly talk about that? And then before I bring the next person on, I'll quickly talk about, we mentioned a moment ago being for your community. Jeff Henderson is going to be doing a webinar later this month. I'll bring up the date really quickly for everyone. It's Thursday, the 25th of March, and it's going to be at 10 a.m. Brisbane time, 10 a.m. Brisbane time. But again, if you go to bricksandclickspodcast.com or to any of our network websites, so furtherfaster.network or irresistiblechurches.network, you'll get information about these webinars with both Jeff Henderson, how you can be for your community, how you can be a church that's known for what you're for. Duncan, tell us a bit about the webinar with Andy Stanley coming up that people can register for, and then I'll go to the next question.
When you ask someone a question and you don't think they're ever going to say yes, so I just said to Andy, any chance? I mean, we have Dave Adamson regularly, and Andy said, Dave who? Don't know him. No, that's not true.
I
thought
Dave, Andy actually said, "Oh, I'll text Dave and tell him that don't do that webinar. I'll do one for you just next month, mate."
So I honestly thought his assistant would just say, "No, Andy's far too busy," and his assistant came back and said, "Yeah, sure." So suddenly I panicked, and already there are hundreds of people signed up for this webinar, and we're just going to talk to Andy about leadership, how he's led his church through COVID, and what we can learn about that. And I don't know anyone better in the world to talk about digital church with than Dave, and I don't know anybody better in the world to talk about leadership with than Andy. So I am so pumped that he's going to join me for a conversation on the 18th of March. It's at noon in the UK and Ireland, which is probably not a good time for you guys in Australia, but it will be recorded. So it's
we'll put it
lunchtime.
on Bricks and Clicks, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's noontime, and you can, if you go to furtherfaster.network/Andy Stanley, I'll put it into the chat, then you can register there. And the cost is exactly the same cost as this webinar is, absolutely zilch, zero.
So are you saying, Duncan, that Andy Stanley's a cheap date like Dave Adamson? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, as long as you buy them a bun, they're quite happy. They're very happy.
A bun. That's awesome. Hey, as we're bringing on this
what
next
is a
panelist,
bun?
I have no idea. What?
A
Can you,
bun?
Duncan, is that
British? Do you not know what a sticky bun is?
Oh, sticky bun. Sticky bun. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Sticky bun and some clotted cream. All right. So we're gonna bring on Ivan, who's got a great question. But while I'm bringing him on, Dave Adamson, here is a great question, all the way from the West Coast, best coast of Australia, Perth. Michael is asking, how do we create an army of young people who become social media influencers and pointing people to Jesus? I think that's a great question, Michael. It's fantastic. I love it. And then we'll bring Ivan on, because Ivan's going to talk about transitioning people from online family and online adult ministries as well. So it'll tie into the family ministries theme.
So I'm answering Ivan's question, right?
No, you're answering Michael's question, which is the one about creating the army of online influencers with young people. And then Ivan's going to ask his question.
Michael, the short answer is you don't have to create them. They're already there. They're already in your church. They already grew up. They're in the church as digital natives, and they're just waiting for their opportunity to be unleashed into creating this. So one of the things I did at North Point was I created what I called 2 influencer lists. There was an influencer list of staff members, and this is staff members who had over a certain number of followers, which is arbitrary to your church, obviously from a percentage basis, who had over a certain number of followers on social media or a social media platform. And then I created a influencer list of people who were within our church who had a big influence or micro influence on a certain social media platform. And then I just resourced them and gave them the opportunity to talk about our church. Like, that's literally all you need to do. So they're already there. We just need to have somebody who can gather them together and identify them and then release them into what the church wants to achieve. That's the short answer to the question.
Love it. Hey, Ivan, why don't you introduce yourself really quickly by telling us what church you're connected to, Ivan, where you're from, where you're watching from in the world. We'd love to know. And then go ahead and ask Dave your question. I thought it was a fantastic question.
So I we're in England, in Andover, and I'm from Andover Baptist Church. I'm the children and youth director at our church. So and the question that I had was, how do you bridge the gap between quote unquote adult online and kids and youth online? How do you bring those 2 worlds together on any platform? We're kind of running 2 different social media things, and I think that's great and good. But how do you bring that together?
Wow, Ivan, such a good question, but such a hard answer, right? Because that's really, I think, where the rubber hits the road, because it's one thing, and most of us are geared naturally towards creating services that our young adults or our adults will attend, but hitting those, reaching kids makes it a little bit harder again. to answer your question specifically, I've seen a lot of churches create online content that's uniquely for the kids that they then reach out to parents and encourage parents to watch with their kids. And they post that to things like YouTube. I know organizations that create church strategy and church resources like Orange, for example, which if you're a member of the Further Faster Network or the Irresistible Churches Network in Australia, you get access to Orange. They specifically design their content to not separate, but create content that's for kids, create content that's for students, and then bring the parents into that. So I think what I lean into most, Ivan, to answer your question really directly, is I think it's incumbent upon us as church leaders to connect with the parents of the kids and partner with them, because during COVID, during a season when there's a lockdown or when, you know, as happens here in Australia, like a city like Melbourne will go into a hard lockdown for a 5-day period where church has to be canceled for that weekend. I think that's when it's really important that church leaders have created a bridge to parents to help equip parents to disciple their kids. Parents during a pandemic are bearing the brunt of the expectations of the workload. They're trying to keep their jobs, trying to work from home. They're often the teacher because their schools have been closed down or there's online learning. And then they're also the youth pastor as well. And parents just aren't equipped for that because over the generations, over the decades, we've created a culture where parents can just drop their kids off in kids ministry or student ministry and they'll take care of that. And we as parents don't have to worry about that. So I think the churches that will succeed are the ones that are, first of all, bridging that gap and partnering with parents and then equipping the parents so that they can do that job of discipleship until the buildings open up again or until we can figure out a better way to connect with the kids. So it's all about that partnership happening first. I think the obvious answer we lean to is I need to create kids content that's going to keep the kids satisfied and occupied for 35 minutes or something along those lines. But I think what's more important is for us to create resources that equip parents to have those conversations and do the discipleship with their own kids.
Right.
So good. And just so, Ivan, I don't know if you're already a part of the Orange community. If you are, fantastic. If you are not, man, I'm telling you, they not only have they got great done for you resources, but it comes with just tons of experienced people behind it, educators, pastors, youth workers, like all of the above, helping to create the content. And parents as well, because we are trying to bring parents in.
Perko, Ivan is my ministry area consultant for kids.
Okay, great question.
So he is our Orange go-to for our network.
Somewhat familiar, but maybe others on the webinar are not as familiar or listening to the podcast. But go check out Rethink Orange if you haven't.
Can I ask Ivan a question? Ivan, what have you been doing that's been successful in your church to connect with parents and to provide those resources?
Yeah, I think we're trying to, so we've been leaning heavily into Orange. So we've been posting a lot of the Orange content. We've been using in different forms, cutting and pasting a few of the videos. So that goes out twice weekly now. We've stolen all their Instagram images, so that goes out, that's scheduled out every week now for all the different age groups. We leaning heavily into Parent Q, which is great. It's got all the blogs on there, it's got all that great insight. We're doing some podcasts. We've been doing we've called our podcast Parenting Reality Bites podcast, just little kind of insets of normal parents going through some really normal stuff, trying to make everybody feel normal in this time, that some of the stresses and strains going through that. So we've been trying to bridge the gap that way. We're finding that email is just overwhelming at the moment. Like we're just never getting enough clicks to open that. So out of 50 people, we'll get 4 people open up an email. So, you know, we're always trying to find different ways. And why the question, how do you bridge that gap better in this time, and try to bring those two, almost feels kind of separate sometimes. So how do you bring that connection to the forefront?
Yeah, that's good, Ivan. That sounds so good. And I just want to throw this out there. As I said earlier on, and maybe some people weren't here for it, but I actually work for Orange now. And so I'm the director of Orange for Australia and New Zealand. But if you're in the UK, if there's anything I can do to help support your efforts, anybody who's watching this, if you want to know what Orange is, or if you're using Orange and you want to get deeper into it or leverage it a little bit more, or find out what Ivan was talking about with ParentQ, please email me and I will connect you with the Orange specialist for your area, for your community, because we do have those. So just you can hit me up at dave@thinkorange.com, dave@thinkorange.com.
Perfect. Hey, Ivan, in the words of my good friend Duncan Banks, we're going to get rid of you at this point and send you back to the panelists.
Thanks
Sorry,
so much.
not to the panelists, send you back to being an attendee. We've got some questions still coming in, and I wish that we could get to all of them. But I do want to bring in Io. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
Io is going to come in and he's going to ask his question. But as he's coming in, just want to encourage everyone with this, that we're going to make available all of the content, the things that we've talked about on the webinar so far tonight. So webinars that are coming up, contact details for Dave, contact information for Further Faster, Irresistible Churches Network, Orange, all of the above. We're going to get that out to everyone via email. So by registering for this particular webinar, you gave us your email address in order to register. And so we'll get that content out to you. I think I've got Io. He's actually logged in here as an attendee, I think 4 or 5 different times. This guy seems to have a lot of technology going on. Wherever he's at, he is an attendee 4 times over, which is impressive. I mean, I'll be honest, I've only got 3 devices, and I don't think my Apple Watch lets me do a webinar. So I'd be down to just 2, my phone and my laptop. But 4 logins to the webinar, I think that should get some sort of an award, Duncan, in my opinion. Io, if you are there, man, we would love to hear your question. So go ahead and reveal yourself. If not, we'll go to Duncan, and I know you've got a question. Maybe I'll try one of the other Ios that is attending the webinar. Let me try a different one and see if we get the right one. Duncan, you can take it from here, my friend. You can grab it. I know you've got a burning question on your tip of your tongue.
IO's great. IO's church. I've been coaching IO's church for a little while now. They are the
I can't wait to meet IO. I'm
Honestly,
disappointed that I haven't.
Everybody needs to hang on and meet IO, because he is the most life-giving pastor I think I've ever met. I can't help but
now
smile
come on
every time
as a 6. I think he's actually got 6 attendee roles now. We're going to try this one here.
He is the Ted Lasso of pastors.
He's the Ted Lasso. IO.
There he is.
IO, our infamous, famous Nigerian pastor from the UK with 6 attendee rankings in our.
Yeah.
You know what? This is the way, Duncan and Dave, to make you feel better about your webinar, is to get a few friends to actually log in 6 or 7 times, and all of a sudden you got hundreds of attendees on your webinar. It's fantastic.
No, it's because IO likes the deal. He knows it's free, so he's thinking, I'll register 6 times because it's free.
I want to get this. I want to get this webinar.
I think I just solved the mystery.
It.
Actually, we had some of the leaders in our leaders group asking for the link, so I've forwarded the link to them so they could join the webinar. So because it's specific to my name, they've used.
They're all logged in as you.
So.
And then when I brought them into the panel, they were scared to death to turn their video on. That was the last thing they wanted. I don't want to be on that panel. I love it.
Ask a question.
I'll ask the question.
Name of your church, where you're located, and then I would love to hear you ask your question today.
Oh, fantastic. The name of the church is Transformation House Church. We've just become a part of the For the Faster Network. And we're
welcome
to be part of that. We're based in St. Albans in the UK, so just south of London, just a few minutes drive outside London. Now, the question is actually not mine, but I'll read the question. It says that we're all in agreement that the digital and physical experience are valuable. is there a way that we can make the physical in-person experience different to the digital one, so people still prioritize the physical experience when they're able to? So is there a way to still do something extra to encourage people to jump from the digital work to come actually to our in-person meetings?
Yeah, great question. That's an awesome question. Cheers to whoever wrote that, because that is the thing that we're starting to figure out, right? Especially here in Australia, as we move deeper into this post-COVID sort of mentality, we're starting to figure some of that stuff out, or approach some of it. This was actually a question, and Perko and Duncan, I'd be encouraging you to ask Andy about this on the next webinar. This was a conversation I had with him probably about June last year. When we started streaming our services at North Point, what we realized pretty quickly is the Zoom fatigue started to set in. And so our viewer retention rate started to plummet. Like, we were in the 76%, and then that moved to really quickly to about the 35% and even down to the low 30%. And so I was brought into a meeting where I was asked a specific question. Hey, what do you think needs to happen? And so what we did was we shortened the service, moved worship away from the front of the service, moved it to the back of the service. And so what typically would happen is we just started streaming services like we normally would, right? A couple of songs at the front, a host, and then the message. Well, we flipped that on its head and started doing the message right out of the gate, a couple of announcements, and then worship. And as we did that, our services started to kick off, and our viewer retention started to stay really, really high again. And so what I suggested in those moments, as we saw that starting to happen, was I said to Andy, if we start our services typically at 9 a.m., I think the live stream of those services should start at about 9:15 with a host that's maybe live in the foyer, or maybe live in the control room, or in the hallway, something, and is just basically biding time until worship is over, and then saying, hey, we're so glad you joined us today. We're going to be hearing a message from Andy Stanley. He's going to be preaching about this specific topic, and this is part 3 of a series, whatever it might be, and then throw directly to the message to keep that online component really, really short. And what that does is, I think it would create that we'd still have that good viewer retention rate, but it also creates an opportunity. If people want to experience that live worship, they have to come to the building. We've removed that from the live stream, and we've created an element in our service that already exists that they can't get any other way other than being in the building. And for me, as an online pastor, as a social media pastor, as somebody who obviously, loves this style of ministry, I think the one thing that online can't crack is in-person worship. So if we kept that from our live streams and made that an in-person only event, that's what I think will entice people to come back to the building, because I do think we need to get people back into the building, but we need to make those online opportunities available as well. So that's how I would be doing it. I would take out the worship from the live streams that we do in a couple of months from now and just make that an in-person only event.
That's fantastic. On behalf of all the IOs on the call, I want to say a big thank you.
I was actually just going to say, IO, the person that wrote the question is actually Andy, who you asked spoke with last June. Yeah. Dave, you were talking with Andy. You just said last June.
Brilliant.
And Andy's logged in as IO. He said in the chat here. So
of course. Hey, Andy.
That's Andy's asking the question through IO's link. I love it. Duncan, you've got a final question for us to wrap up the webinar. IO, mate, welcome to the network. You have found an incredible tribe of leaders in the UK and Ireland. I love hanging out with the Further Faster network, and I know you will too. So welcome to the network, mate. And thanks for being with us on the panel. We'll let you get back to being an attendee.
Hey, listen, I've noticed Kevin Thomas. He's one of the pastors in your network, isn't he, Kevin? And he says he does what Dave's talking about: 2 songs at the front as part of our feed, and then post feed 20 minutes worship and prayer. I've talked to Kevin. I love the model that he's putting together. What church is he at? Can we go and see that online?
Yeah, it's our church in Burleigh Heads, Queensland. So our church, not as in like Dave and my church, but it's a brilliant name, guys. Our church, OUR CHURCH, Burley
Do you want to
Heads,
come to?
Queensland.
Do you want to come to our church on Sunday? Yeah, it's brilliant.
Exactly.
I love it. But
Yeah.
honestly, check that out, because I've talked to Kevin before and I'm really impressed with that. It's fantastic. I
They
love that
also,
model.
Duncan, they also are pioneering something, in-person gatherings, because they happen to be in a community that is heavy in the hospitality industry, which I know in the UK and Ireland, you guys are like, hospitality industry? What is that again? We actually are going out to dinners and things like that nowadays. And they're on the Gold Coast. And because of the hospitality industry, so many people are working on the weekends. They're doing something that is unique that I love. And Dave, this goes back to you being you in your community, for your local community. They've started Monday night gatherings for their local community, which is a brilliant concept to make it available and accessible to people that are working on the weekends. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, our time is through. We've gone 10 minutes over what we should, but I have one more question for Dave. Just before I do, if some of the things, if you're in the UK or you're in Ireland and you listen to this, and some of the things Dave is saying is really making you think about, how do I take a next step and start moving forward with this? We're running what we're calling a leadership cohort, the Further Faster Network. So April, May and June, you sign up and there's a call once a month for 90 minutes where we get some input from some of Andy Stanley's staff at North Point. And then you get a chance to meet with some like-minded leaders. You get a ton of resources as well, just to help you take some next steps in all this stuff. So it's April, May and June, 3 calls. And the cost of that is exactly the same amount of money as you've paid to be on this webinar with Dave. It's completely and utterly free. I'll put the address into the chat just there, so you can sign up there if you'd like to be part of that, and we'd love to see you there. But Dave, I wonder if you could, I'm being a bit greedy here because I'm talking on behalf of UK pastors here. And what's happening in our country right now is that we're probably going to start meeting in person the back end of the summer, I reckon. So we've kind of got from Easter, which is happening in about 3 or 4 weeks' time, until the back end of the summer to start preparing ourselves for in-person and digital services. Could you give us a bit of a, what are your top 3 tips? What should we be concentrating on, focusing? We're lead pastors. We don't want to just suddenly turn up and our Prime Minister say, you can go to church next Sunday. And we think, let's ditch the digital and get straight. What can we start doing now so that there's a seamless link between digital and physical when we get to the summer and we can start meeting in person? What should we be focusing, paying attention to, concentrating on? Give us our marching orders for the next 3 months.
Yeah. Good question. Good way to end it. Because I think this is not just for the UK. I think it's for Australia and anybody who's really watching as well. First of all, I would say, make sure that when you step back into your building, you don't step back into time. As I said earlier, the world has changed, our habits have changed. And so we need to have this online component, whether it's what I just suggested before to Ayo or Andy, whoever it was that asked the question, about keeping something from the live stream, like worship, for example, to make that the enticing thing that gets people in the building. Starting to process that now before it comes up, and how you would go about doing that, I think is a huge part of the key. The next part is, now is the time, if you haven't done it already, now is the time to start building that engagement that I was talking with Matt about during the week on all of your social media platforms. That might mean that you take your dog for a walk and pick up your cell phone and stream live to Facebook, or stream live to Instagram, or stream live to YouTube, and just ask people how you can pray for them in your local community. So that would be one thing that I'd be doing now if you haven't done it already. Now, a lot of pastors will say, well, it's been a year, it's probably too late. No, it's not too late. Do that now. Start doing that now. Figure out ways to connect with your church community during the week in short little bursts that you don't have to preach a 45-minute message on a Thursday night on your phone. It just needs to be, take your dog for a walk, and however long it takes you to walk around the block, pray for people live and in person. That would be my first, the first thing I would be suggesting that you do. And then, outside of those things, now's the time for you to start building a robust social media presence. across the board. So that's YouTube, that's Instagram, that's figuring out how you're going to be leveraging those things during the week. And then also creating that content, repurposing on purpose, like I said, taking that content and figuring out how you're going to break that down. I've got actually a little PDF that I could probably send to you guys, and I'll brand it specifically. That is this inverse pyramid, which breaks it down. The upside down pyramid. This is your long form content at the top, which is your 35-minute message you're already preaching. How to edit that down so that you can put it on specific platforms, and then edit it down again so that it's lowering the bottom rung of the digital invitation ladder. So they would be the things that I would be doing right now. It's not too late to do any of those things. Now is the time that you need to be doing it as you start to move into that hybrid, or what I call the omni-channel approach, where you are seamlessly connecting with people throughout the week with a single concentrated message that isn't about recreating new content. It's just about distributing the content that you're already creating in strategic ways on strategic platforms to reach strategic people. And then the last thing would be, leaning into that thing again. Find out what the needs are in your local community and figure out ways that you, your staff team, and your whole church can meet the needs of the wider community. That's what people are going to remember at the end of the pandemic. They're not going to remember how good your live stream was. They're not going to remember how many times you posted on Instagram. What they're going to remember is, when our time of need, that church down the road, they stood up and they served and they supported us and they encouraged us and they gave us hope. They gave us inspiration in the time when we needed it the most. And so when things go back to quote unquote normal, but their life starts falling apart, they're going to go, what can I do? Well, I'm going to go to that church that was so inspirational, so hope-filled, so helpful during that COVID period. So start figuring out ways to do that now, and start figuring out how you, your staff, and your church can meet that need. And the great thing about that, guys, is it doesn't require an expensive microphone or an expensive light or a really expensive camera and somebody who can operate it. This is stuff that you can do right now for free, and it gets to know your community a little bit better and figure out ways to be relevant to your community. Andy Stanley can't do that. Stephen Furtick can't do that. Brian Houston can't do that. Only you can do that.
Well, we hope this episode of Bricks and Clicks was helpful. If it was, then we'd love if you could leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you are leading a church in Australia, the UK, or Ireland, we'd love to help you grow your church by reaching unchurched people. Go to www.bricksandclickpodcast.com and click on your country's flag to find a whole bunch of free resources to help your church go further, faster, and become irresistible once again.